Hey everybody, this is Alex Bonham-Carter of Crowntown Headgear, and I'm going to talk to you about how I make headbands and what I use to do them with. So to begin, this is a piece of denim. It is 48 inches by 6 inches, and what I'm doing is I'm folding it in half and I'm just pressing with the iron. I don't want to drag the iron back and forth, I just want to press up and down because that's going to allow me to press the fabric without distorting the fabric. It is pretty important not to distort the fabric if you want to have straight seams, which I think everybody does who makes headbands. And so the first pass, certainly I will just press it. Now the form is sort of set, the crease is there. Now I can sort of drag it back and forth. But that is the basic first step. So for this part, what I want to do is I need to place my terry towel pad. And first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my template on the folded piece of fabric to figure out where the center will be, the center of the template and also the center of the fabric. Obviously the fabric is much larger than I need, but I did that for this demonstration because I wanted to show you that it's going to be faster to start with a rectangle as opposed to shaving out a very narrow band. So that ruler that I'm using there is a Fiskars brand acrylic ruler. It measures 7 inches on either side of the center. So I use that to center my headband, my towel, excuse me. Because my towel is 8 inches, I know that one side of the towel has to reach 4 inches on one side and then the 4 inches on the other side, and then it's going to be centered. So I'm setting the towel on a piece of scrap cardboard so that I can use my Otif 505 temporary adhesive spray to spray the towel so that I can fold it into a as perfect of a rectangle as I can do it. Obviously it's terry towel, so it's not going to fold super neatly. There is a little bit of stretch to it, but that's okay. As long as it is fairly rectangular shaped, I'm going to fold the top and bottom of the towel first, and then I'm going to press the edges together. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it on a piece of scrap acrylic, and then I put another piece of scrap acrylic over the top, and I'm going to press it extra firm. So all of the adhesion is going to stick to the towel, and it's going to form it to hopefully its final shape. So then what I have to do is I have to spray the corners, or the long side, so I can fold that again. And that is obviously pretty delicate, so I'll typically just hold it in my hand and fold it with my thumbs, as I'm demonstrating now. So after I've sprayed just a little bit on the edges, I don't want to spray the center of it yet because I still want to press it with my pieces of acrylic, and I don't want it to stick to the acrylic. So I'm pressing it with my thumbs. Looks like a pretty good shape. Now I'm going to press it between those two pieces of acrylic again, just to make sure that it's as formed as it's going to be, as tight as it's going to be. And you can see that the rectangle is nearly perfect. It's not going to be, mathematically perfect, but it is going to be good enough for our uses, for my uses at least. So now what I'm doing is I'm setting it against the ruler that I've offset from the fold by 1/4 of an inch. And the reason why I do that is because when I'm edge stitching, I know that the presser foot has to go somewhere. And I don't want the presser foot to create a bulge. I don't want that top stitch along the bottom of the terry towel to be super, super thin because the presser foot is not able to grip all of the fabric. So I do raise it up from the seam about 1/4 of an inch, sometimes a little bit more depending on the thickness of the fabric that I'm working with. And I'm lining it up to both sides of the ruler so that it is going to be the same distance on either side from the center. and then I'm pressing it down. And then, as you guessed, I am going to take my pieces of acrylic and I'm going to press it again while I pull away the ruler, because sometimes the corners of the terry that have a little bit of spray on them stick to the ruler, so I want to press down with the acrylic sheet so that it doesn't stick to the ruler and pull itself away when I'm taking away the ruler. Here I am sitting at my Singer 201, and I'm going to use this machine as soon as I can pull that thread through the needle hole. Almost got it. Come on, a little faster, a little faster. These people have got things to do. Almost there. Okay. Now I'm going to use this machine and that thread to stitch the towel. Now, for stitching the towel, I want to make sure that my pressure on the presser foot is a little looser than I need, because I don't want to distort those even lines of the towel as the presser foot is moving, or as the fabric is moving under the presser foot, I should say. So I'm using a 116 size needle, and I'm using Tex 40 thread, so fairly thick thread, sort of the thread that you would find on a pair of jeans, and a needle that can definitely puncture through all of those layers without any kind of problems. And this machine happens to be set up to a industrial sewing machine servo motor. It's not a domestic motor, so it gives me even more needle control. It allows me to sew very slowly. I typically sew the towel on about 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little bit less, from the edge, because I don't want the stitches just to go through the very edge of the fabric, because sometimes there's no actual fabric there, it's just a little hair sticking off of the terry, which would give me a weak join. So I want to make sure that I'm stitching through plenty of meat, so to speak. And then the edges I want to be as symmetrical as possible. The edges I'll usually do 1/4 as well, or if sometimes I'm doing it a little bit narrower than 1/4, I make sure to mimic it on both sides, and I'll explain why as soon as I finish. So I have set up my machine so it is going to feed correctly. I monkey with the pressure knob quite often while I'm sewing things, because I want the machine to do as much work for me as possible, because I'll always get the cleanest stitches when the fabric is feeding by itself and I don't have to white knuckle it or anything like that. You don't want to be pulling from the back of the machine to pull the fabric through, and you don't want to try to push it from the front either, because that's going to give you awful stitches. So I certainly recommend setting up your machine so that it is going to feed itself accurately and give you the best stitches. And again, I'm making sure that that edge is as close to the previous edge as I can make it, and I'll explain why here in a second. But it is important for my construction to make sure that both of the edges of the towel look uniform. And then I have the needle thread from the previous, from the starting point, I should say, right there next to my finger. And I'm just going to overlap the stitches and lock the stitches in. And normally what I'll do is I'll overlap by, 3 or 4 stitches, just because if it loosens up a little bit, I don't want the stitch to break free, because once I've turned the band, then it will create a lot of work to have to unpick everything and turn it again in order to fix the terry if it loosens. And if it loosens for a customer, then they're going to be unhappy. So I want to make sure that all of the stitches are locked in as well as I can make them. So I've overlapped, going to pull the needle out, lift the foot, pull it away, and I always like to pull out plenty of tail, because tails are good, so you can, hand tighten things if you need to. So I've put the template on top of the fabric, lining the edge of the template with the edge of the fabric where it's folded, and I have little black lines on my template. You can kind of see me pointing to them. Those black lines are exactly 4 inches on either side from the center, so that helps me line it up with the terry pad because I'm using the stitches from the terry towel to line up those. And that helps me make sure that the band is centered on the fabric and it's going to be centered in relation to the terry towel. And then I'm just using a black pen to trace around the perimeter of the template. In this situation, I want to make sure that I'm not going to use something that's going to bleed, because anything that bleeds will be visible on the front of the fabric, which is not going to be very good. And then I want to also make my little notches on the tail to tell me when I should leave my little opening for the turning hole to turn the whole band through. Okay, so here I am sitting at the Juki 1541. It is a compound walking foot industrial machine. Walking foot just basically means that the needle is attached to a center portion of the presser foot, which will pivot back and forth. So it basically helps to feed the fabric from the top, as well as the traditional feed dogs that you would find on any domestic sewing machine. This helps me a lot with denim because obviously denim has quite a bit of stretch inherent to it, and I don't want the fabric to stretch as I'm sewing it, because then that's going to mean that my seams will not be even and it won't have a uniform headband shape. So I've stitched up from the bottom of the tail, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in reverse and I'm going to stitch back to the edge of the tail again. And then of course I'm going to do the same thing forward again. So that portion of the tail will have 3 stitches on top of each other. And I always like to sort of over-engineer this portion of the headband, especially because that is a high wear portion. That tail is going to get a lot of use. People are going to be tying it on, pulling it off. It's going to be bumping around in the laundry, into the gear bag, everywhere else. So that is a situation where I want to use as strong of a threading as possible, because I want to make sure that it doesn't fall apart at the tips. So when I've finally got to the edge of that template line, I am going to pivot. And I guess I didn't mention this, but I'll mention it now. I am stitching beyond the template line. I line the left side of the foot up to the template line. That's another reason why I want to make sure that the pen marks don't bleed, because any time that you're making marks within those stitches, that means that when you turn it, it's possible for that portion of the fabric to show through. So if you're using like a black Sharpie marker or something like that, you want to stitch underneath the line as opposed to beyond the line. So there I am moving slowly down the tail. You can kind of see what I was talking about with the compound feeding. You can see that it's kind of pivoting in an unusual way during the stroke. So the needle is actually swinging forward, gripping the fabric and then pulling it back. And then it also has the traditional feed dogs on the bottom. So that doesn't eliminate any kind of movement that the fabric may have if it's especially stretchy, but coupled with a very light presser foot pressure, it doesn't give me too many problems. If you don't happen to have one of these machines and you're using a single stitch drop feed traditional machine, the way to sort of mimic this would be to just loosen the presser, wow, tongue twister. Loosen that in order to make sure that the fabric is not being distorted as the presser foot is pushing on it. So you loosen it all the way, and then you just start tightening it until the fabric begins to feed completely, and then you stop. There's no reason for you to hammer down on it with each stroke, unless you're trying to sandwich something together in such a way that you wouldn't be able to get it to stick otherwise. If you can't use like pins or clips, you could certainly use more force on the presser foot. But you really don't want to do that too often, because it is going to leave, it will leave marks on the fabric for one thing, but it'll also distort where the line is stitching. So that when you turn the band, it doesn't have a nice gradual curve. It has a sort of an abrupt squeezed portion, and then it sort of bubbles a little bit around the terry towel perhaps, and it just doesn't look very nice. So I obviously have a machine designed to avoid that. And again, on this machine, I'm also using a 116 size needle and Tex 40 thread. So I use the same thread for all of my machines, and usually I use the same needles. This one I sometimes use a 90-14 size needle if I'm using a very light quilting fabric, because I don't want it to pucker the delicate fabric. But since this is a fairly thick denim, 10-ounce denim, I don't have to worry about that. So I'm stitching very slowly. It's about a 3mm stitch on that one, because I want to have as many stitches as possible within reason, because that will help define the shape of the fabric when it turns into an actual headband, when I pull it through the turning hole. When I get to that first notch, I'll backstitch a few times, and then without cutting the fabric or without cutting the thread, I will lift the foot and then drag it to its new starting point at the other notch, and I'll go forward and then back and then forward again, just to make sure that it's in line exactly where I want it in relation to the template stitch, or the template line, I should say. But I like to keep that thread intact. I don't cut the thread, because that will help me cut my allowance, because the thread will have a straight line that will mimic where the stitches would be. So that helps me to cut the allowance to be the exact same length on either side of those notches. And there I am pivoting for that final tail, and pulling the rest of the fabric back onto the table so it doesn't pull it off of the machine, and stitching all the way down to the bottom. And then, you guessed it, I'm going to back tack nearly to the top again, because again, it's another high wear place, and I want to be sure that those stitches hold, whether my customers are hand washing everything in a special bowl of Dawn detergent, or they just throw it into the washer and then throw it into the dryer. I always have to design things with the mindset that not everybody is going to treat it like it's a newborn child. A lot of people just want something to wear while they play paintball, and that's totally fine. They shouldn't have it fall apart. And I apologize for the lighting on this one, guys, but you can kind of see that the very dark line is the template line, and then the line above it is the stitch line, and it looks pretty good to me. So let's continue. So usually when I'm cutting the allowances, I'll just cut a rough chop on the tail edge, just to kind of cut away some of the excess, and then I will focus most of the attention on the allowance across the top of the headband. In this particular case, and really in most cases, I'll cut a loose 1/4 inch. It's not going to be exact, because I don't measure or use any other lines or rulers or anything like that to make sure that it's a perfect 1/4 inch allowance, because in my experience, that's not as crucial as having a good template stitch line. So once the template line is stitched in place, the allowance can vary a little bit, and you're not going to see a huge difference in the actual construction of the headband or in the finished product. So I'm just getting down to the end of the tail, and then, as I said before, I'm just going to kind of loosely chop off the tip of the tail. I'm not going to get very specific, because I will have to actually put it out on the table and bring it into view so I can take a little bit more time cutting that allowance correctly. So I'm cutting off that thread from the turning hole gap, and then I'm going to work on the tail tips in order to make sure that the tail is as sharp as I can make it. So in this case, I'm starting on the tail tip that's closest to the turning hole, because that's going to be my test tail, because that's going to be the fastest to turn and see how the allowance that I'm cutting is changing how the tail will look. So I'm lopping off the corner at the bottom, and I'm cutting off the corner at the top, so it's got kind of a rounded shape. And then I guess I didn't like that. I'm going to cut a little bit more. So it's basically rounded, with the stitch being still straight. And I'm going to pull it back through, and then I'm going to use my clover turning tool to press out the top of the tail first. And I try to have a pretty loose grip on the fabric at this point. I don't want to try to force the turning tool into any of the corners. I just want to kind of wiggle it into place and wiggle it into its final position. If you force it, then you're just going to bend and distort the allowance itself, and you're not actually going to do much with the tail. And now I'm using a R&K brand turning tool. It's basically like a metal, I don't know, it's like a metal pencil basically. And that looks pretty straight, looks pretty good. So I'm going to cut the other tail just the same way. So I'm cutting off a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch on the tail tips, a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch, somewhere in that kind of range. And I'm rounding the bottom corner. Again, I don't want to cut through the stitch. That's going to be a bad idea, but I'm cutting as close to the stitch as I can just for the corners, because I still want to have some shape in the tail. I don't want to cut off all of the excess allowance, but I don't want to have any corners to contend with after I turn it. So you can see I'm measuring it there, and it's about 1/8 of an inch on the edge of the tail, and then it's going to be about 1/4 of an inch, a little bit less than 1/4 on the top of the tails. And magically I lost the footage for the initial ironing. So basically what we missed is I turned the headband and then I ironed it, pressing and not dragging the iron. And now the headband is mostly formed, but essentially I am just going to press over the seams as much as I can, because I want to make sure that the seams line up as nicely and as neatly as possible. Again, no dragging here. I'm just pressing and lifting the iron, because that's going to give me the cleanest lines. I would argue that this is probably the most important step to making a good headband, to really make sure that those seams are lining up neatly and as evenly as possible. And I usually use the iron on a high setting, and sometimes I'll spend as much as 5-10 minutes just ironing the same headband over and over again. And now, because the turning hole obviously doesn't have any stitches securing it, I am using clips to make sure that it is held on both sides, both in front of at the beginning of the hole and at the end of the hole. And then I flip it over and I use the edge of the iron to press out the bottom below the terry and above the terry as well, because those are areas where just pressing from the top is not going to be good enough to secure it. So I iron both sides, but I spend an extra amount of time ironing with just the tip of the iron along the top of the towel and the bottom of the towel as well. Those are the areas that are going to give the sewing machine the most amount of problems, because those are areas that typically, if you're just pressing from the top or pressing over the towel, the fabric itself is not actually being compressed. It's just kind of getting heated up. So that I'm pressing over the towel again after I've already pressed all the corners, and then I'm using a piece of wood which is called a tailor's clapper to press down on the fabric above the towel and below the towel as well. Basically, there's nothing really magic about a tailor's clapper. It's literally just a piece of wood that's kind of got a hand hold shaped into it, and then you steam the area that you want to press, and then instead of just pressing down with the iron and potentially scorching or damaging the fabric, you steam into the fabric, and then you take the iron away and you put the clapper down and just press it with all your might. Just really pop a blood vessel trying to get that as straight and clean and tight as possible. So now I'm working on the second curve beyond the terry towel pad, because I want to make sure that the headband has a uniform shape. I want to make it as symmetrical as possible. Why not? Strive for excellence. Okay, cool trick here. So if you have a machine that has a complicated arrangement of thread guides and it takes you a long time to rethread the machine every time you want to change the thread, cut the thread beyond the spool, tie on your new thread to the tail of the old thread, And then when you pull the thread through the machine, it will bring the new thread with you. So you can see that I had it originally threaded with white, and now I'm using black. So I just pull on the white tail and it pulls the black with it. And then I can cut off the white portion, thread the black through the eye of the needle, and it is ready to go in a fraction of the time. So again, we're using the Singer 201. I've got a 116 size needle and Tex 40 thread, which I actually have on a thread stand that is to the right of the camera. You can't see it, but the thread is passing through that thread guide on the wooden spool where the typical spool of thread would go. So now what I'm doing is I'm lining up the band with the right toe of the presser foot dead center, because that's going to give me basically an 1/8 of an inch stitch line, which is close enough for me. Some people like to go narrower, some people like to go wider, but 1/8 of an inch is good for me because I'm not using any kinds of guides for this portion. I don't use magnets, I don't use bolt-on guides, I don't use presser feet that have guide sort of pieces of metal that are sticking off of them to guide the fabric. I don't use any of that stuff. I'm just eyeballing it against the middle of the toe of the presser foot. So again, I'm starting, I guess I didn't say this earlier, but I'm starting right where the tag is going to go because I'm going to use the tag to conceal the top stitch join from the, the start and the stop of the top stitch. And instantly I am sort of pressing the fabric down with my left hand because I want to make sure that I get a good even stitch line by the terry towel, which is typically a notorious area to start sewing because that is going to give you the most number of problems. So even though it looks like I'm forcing the fabric with my left hand, I'm actually just pressing it down because I don't want the presser foot to kind of squeeze the fabric away from the needle. So with my left hand I'm guiding the fabric, and with my right hand I'm holding onto the tail of the headband in my lap, and I'm kind of using my right hand to sort of control it like you would control a rudder of a small boat. I'm sort of steering it with my right hand and really doing most of the guiding with my left hand. So I think I'm almost beyond the towel, so I can stitch a little bit faster knowing that it's just one layer. I don't have to fight around the terry towel. And again, I'm sewing pretty slowly. I'm not in a huge rush because I make all of my stuff custom to order, so my time frame is my time frame, and I don't have to worry about meeting unrealistic deadlines or banging out 25 headbands in a few days. I'm doing, just fine if I make one headband a day or a couple of headbands a day. That is enough for me. This started as a hobby, and I don't ever want it to turn into a full-fledged business because then I'm going to lose the pleasure of doing it. It's not fun if you're working to a deadline. It's more fun if you're working on your own time. Or at least that's how I think of it. So again, sewing pretty slowly because I don't have any guides to rely on. I can't feed it super fast without having an awful stitch. And I want to make the top stitch as neat as possible. Mainly because everybody else has very neat top stitches. So if I were to create a top stitch line that doesn't look very good, then there would be no incentive for somebody to buy products from Crowntown Headgear when they could get products from somebody else that actually knows what they're doing. So on the tail edges, I will go with a slightly wider stitch. Right now I'm lining up the outer edge of the foot to the outer edge of the fabric, mainly because when I'm doing the tails on this machine, because it's kind of got an old-fashioned feed dog arrangement, there's just not a lot to grip the fabric and feed the fabric when the foot is halfway, when that toe is halfway off the edge of the fabric. That means that there's just not a lot of weight holding that fabric in place. So I have to go a little bit wider so I can get a good amount of fabric under the foot just to feed a little bit more consistently. And then when I get to the edge, I'm looking at it from the side to make sure that it's a good starting point for when I pivot the fabric. And one thing I didn't note earlier, I should say, is that when I'm pivoting the fabric like this, I make sure to pivot after the needle has begun the upward stroke. And the reason why I do that is because that will help the tension to be consistent on the edge. Sometimes if you push the needle in and then you lift the presser foot and then pivot the fabric and the needle is still in the downward stroke, when it comes up again after the pivot, it can pull the bobbin with it. It'll pull the bobbin thread, and so you'll have a kind of a, you'd recognize it if you saw it, but it's basically like where you're supposed to have a right angle or a slanted angle between the two lines of stitch. It'll have kind of a star-shaped pattern instead, because the bobbin thread will come out and it won't be holding the needle thread evenly. So it doesn't look very nice. It probably has some ramifications structurally as well, but as far as that point, for me it's just aesthetic. I want to have good even stitch tension across all of the headband. I don't want to just have the tails look awful. And I've struggled with tails a lot, just because I haven't been able, took me a long time to notice that the machine is really the big variable on the tails, because if the fabric is not feeding correctly, the feed dogs are not coming up high enough, the presser foot is not pushing down with enough even pressure, then I'll have problems on the tail. So tails are a big source of contention for me, because I'm only now recently, within like the last year, really becoming cognizant of the fact that there are so many more variables on a sewing machine than I initially thought. And I've been sewing for about 5 years now, so previous 4 years it was just kind of like, hey, that worked out really well, I don't know why. Hey, that didn't work out really well, I don't know why. But now it is something that I look at whenever I get a new machine. I always make sure that the feed dogs are coming up just enough, not too much, and that the presser foot has enough pressure, not too much, but just enough to feed the fabric without distorting it. So now I've passed the towel, and you can kind of see that I'm not gripping the fabric as heavily as I was just a moment ago, because the towel, again, is the biggest nuisance for headband creation. And I know that several people like to top stitch towel side up, so they can see where the towel is and they can help kind of steer around it. To me, that sounds like a good idea, but the problem that I have with it is that the top stitch always looks a little bit flatter on the back than on the top. So if you have the headband reversed, like upside down, then that means that you're giving the best stitches, the one that you can actually see, to the rear of the headband where nobody can see them. Whereas the front of the headband, you have no idea what it looks like, and that kind of worries me a little bit. So now I'm getting to the turning hole, and I'm removing my clips, and I'm using my fingers to kind of mimic where the clips were so I can keep that fabric as pinned as possible, because there's no seam stitch to hold that turning hole in place. So the fabric could pucker around the needle, or it might get pushed out of position with the foot, and then people will be able to see where the turning hole is, and where's the fun in that? So again, lining it up on that edge, so when I pivot, the corner of the fabric is in line with the outside of the foot, not the middle of the foot like the rest of the band, but the outside, because as I mentioned earlier, the tails are going to be a little bit more of a challenge if you try to do a very, very fine edge, unless you have a modern machine or an industrial machine. This machine is 80 years old, I think, so it's it's seen some days, and it's not necessarily going to have the latest and greatest feed dog alignment or arrangement. So it's all for fun. And I really enjoy the machine, so I'm not interested in using a different machine for top stitching, but it's just, it's just one of those variables that I have to account for as I'm top stitching, that the machine has a very old style feed dog arrangement, and that makes for a slightly inconsistent feed, especially if there's not very much fabric underneath the foot. So on corners, on tail tips, I usually go a little bit wider because there's just more there's more fabric for the presser foot to exert pressure on. And here I am heading towards the starting point. We've done the entire headband, and I talked through the entire thing. Incredible. So one thing I want to be sure is that I'm not stitching over the thread tails from the starting point. I have to sort of pull those out of the way like I'm doing right now, just because, it's not going to be the end of the world. You can always fish them out just by applying a little bit of even pressure to them and pull them out from the other stitches if they get stuck under another stitch line. But, it's one more step, and if you're trying to make headbands as quickly as possible, you want to try to streamline as many of those details as you can. So I've also pulled the top thread through the back side of the headband, and I'm going to do the exact same thing with the tails from the end of the edge stitch. So I overlap the starting and the end portion by 1 or 2 stitches. I pull all the threads to the back side of the headband, and then I tie not 1, not 2, but 3 knots tight. I clip off the tails, and then I use a lighter to burn the edges of the thread. Since it's polyester, it'll melt, and then I just press it with my thumb. And it is a very strong way to finish a headband, and it's very clean as well, because you can only see anything from the back side. From the front side, you don't even see where the top stitch began and where it overlapped or anything like that. Now what I usually do is, before I move on to the last step, I'll kind of pull the headband tight and just make sure that when I turn it in half, the terry meets on both sides of the headband. That tells me that the terry is going to be evenly spaced, because I think ultimately everybody wants to have a headband where the terry towel meets in the middle and on both sides it's even. So here we are putting the tag onto where I started and stopped the edge stitch of the headband, and I've already sprayed the back of it with ODIF 505 temporary adhesive, and I am just pressing it down. And then I also like to use a little acrylic ruler that I have on my table to just make sure that the tag is firmly planted. Then when I'm lining it up to the machine, I line the edge of the tag to the inside of the right toe of the presser foot, and I stitched the whole top stitch and the tag edge stitch on the largest stitch that the machine can do, which is slightly larger than a 4mm stitch, and I pivot it after it's begun the upward movement of the stroke, for the same reason as before. I want to make sure that the tension is even, and I want to make sure that the corners of the stitching on the tag are straight and not rounded or, bobbin thread showing or anything like that. Tension for me is especially crucial for tags, because when somebody sees my headbands at a paintball field, they'll say, "Oh, cool headband, what brand is it?" And then someone will show them the tag and they'll say, "It's Crowntown Headgear." And they will see the tag, and they will also see the stitches of the tag. So I spend a lot of time making sure that the tags are sewn on as well and as straight as possible, because that's the detail they see. Look at the tag, look at the stitches. If they look close to the tag and they see that the stitches are lopsided or all over the place or the tension's not correct, then they'll think, okay, well, that's a brand to consider, but obviously they don't spend a lot of time focusing on their craft. That's just how I feel about it. And I'm making sure that the foot lines up as evenly as possible with the edge of the tag, because I want it to look as consistent as possible. And then I'm also going to pull all of the thread, the needle thread, the bobbin thread, from the starting point and the finishing point through to the back side of the headband. So I overlap on the tags. I usually overlap just one stitch, pull all the threads through, and same thing as before, I tie them together 3 times, burn the excess, and that's it. And I think actually I show the very careful burning right there. Oof, look at that. Look at that flame, so close to the fabric and my eyebrows and eyelashes. So there's the tag. Pretty good stitching, I think. Good for me at least. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. Sewing is fun, so be sure to have a good time while you're doing it.